This particular story took place when I was in the Air Force and stationed in Louisiana. I won't mention the name of the base, but I'm sure that there are many people out there who will know which one it is once I make mention of some of the details to this story. This story took place a few years after I had been stationed there. I first arrived to this base in 2006, and upon my arrival, I, along with many other new troops, were greeted with many different stories. So of horror. There were stories about a man in a top hat who walked a dark, long, and narrow dirt road on the outskirts of a storage facility area. There was another story about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and ran off into the woods next to the same place. But my story relates to a separate story that was told to me. It was my second night on shift, as I recall. I was posted with an airman who had been there for several years. He gave a rundown about some little girl who had been visiting her father when the storage area we were working in was being constructed, which was well before any of our time. The story went that that little girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working, but had fallen to her death by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Most of the story didn't make sense to me at the time, but regardless of the facts, it still scared the out of me. To make matters worse, the airman had taken me to the exact place where the supposed story took place. He would shut off the engine and turned off the music as we just sat there in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened. Now, skip forward about 3 years. I was scheduled to work that particular spot of the base this night. Keep in mind that I'd been visiting this spot for years now, but at this point, the storage area had been completely closed down, except for a few minor areas which required us to do physical drive-thrus and checks. The shift itself started out rather shitty. Me and my Alpha Ka partner had been given a cattle truck to do this patrol, as our normal vehicle was in the shop for maintenance. Yeah, I'm not kidding, a cattle truck. I know this part doesn't seem very important to the story at the moment, but it will tie into the story eventually. So, to save on time, let's skip forward a few hours. We were scheduled to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already completed 2 of the 3 prior without any issues. So, come about 4 in the morning, we decided to do our last check. Seeing as all the main maintenance guys had gone home for the night in this area, the only way to access the area was with 2 very large separate gates, which took forever to open. We pile in, lock the gates behind us, and continue on our way. My Alpha was driving during this check, and I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the lock on each structure. An important detail that I left out, which may be necessary here, is that the story of the little girl had taken place on a road within the storage area which we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was fine and we had finished our rounds. My Alpha makes the final turn down Echo Street. We had both been pretty talkative during most of the night, and we were just shooting the shit when I got an uneasy feeling. Something felt different, but I couldn't make out what it was. We were about halfway down the road when things became almost completely and frighteningly silent. Even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint noise of the radio playing seemed to become less audible as we approached the structure from my previous story. And I must stress at this point that even telling or typing this part still brings a chill down my spine and makes my eyes tear up in fear. But as we approached the structure itself, I turned my head to the outside of the window opposite of the structure, and out of my left ear, I hear a sound that nearly caused me to piss myself. It was the sound of a person groaning or moaning in distress, sort of like the moan of the girl from The Grudge. Yes, I'm very serious. The faint, creepy moan begins to ring inside the cab of the truck between the two of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I feel my blood turn cold, and I quickly turn to my Alpha and yell, "Dude, cut that out!" My Alpha turns to me with a confused look on his face. At this point, he begins to take his foot off the accelerator and asks, "Am I going too fast?" I remain silent for a moment with my hand in a pausing gesture, and I listen. I hear the noise again. My partner interrupts and asks, "What's wrong?" I quickly turn the music off without saying anything at first, and then I whisper to him, "Do you hear that?" He stops the truck in confusion and listens closely. It was almost dead silent for a second or two when we both hear it this time, that long, chilling groan of a woman. It echoed in my ears. It sounded like someone was struggling to breathe and taking in a giant breath of air while someone was trying to strangle them. The sound was beyond terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one hearing it only made it more of a horrifying experience. I found myself beginning to ask him my original question again, but he quickly interrupts and says with a strong sound of fear in his voice, "What the fuck is that?" We stupidly waited to see if we could hear it again. The rumble of the gates on the back of the truck are easily heard and recognized as they made a sort of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine has that typical rumble as well. But in between both the noises, we heard it again for the final time. That groan. It sounded even louder, but this time it sounded like it was coming from both inside and outside of the truck, like we were being surrounded by whatever was making that noise of distress. Without even making a peep, my Alpha puts the truck in drive and he hauls our asses off that street quicker than I have ever gone on any other street in that entire base. He nearly flips the truck going around a curve, but it doesn't bother us one bit. We were both in an unspoken agreement that we wanted to get out of there quickly. We got to the 2 gates again, and I hopped out of the truck as fast as I could. My Alpha watched my back as I quickly opened both gates. He jumped back into the driver's seat, sped out, and waited for me to close both gates as well. Once we completed that task, we quickly returned to the main part of the base, and we requested to meet with our flight chief to tell him what had happened. When we finally met up with him, we expected him to think that we were both full of shit, or that we had just imagined the entire thing, being as it was so late into our 12-hour shift and we were both tired. But I clearly remember him saying to the both of us, "I completely believe you." As a matter of fact, I had something like that happen to me twice, once in that same place and the other in that building behind you, as he points at our jailhouse. Again, I know that sounds completely cliché with that grudge-like moan we had heard. But it honestly happened, and it still brings those tears of fright into my eyes every time I tell.
I haven't told my story to many people except for my wife and a few other of my close friends. It happened while I was stationed in the army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and I haven't forgotten it to this day. I was a young recruit, freshly drafted out of high school, and I didn't know much about the war. I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for. But what I did know was that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday evening and got loaded onto many buses to be taken to our barracks. The air was very humid and the soil was soaking wet due to a storm that had just passed through the area. I vividly remember the drive and how it stunk like sewer. My first night was uneventful and quiet, but we all felt the tense atmosphere as our drill sergeants taunted us with stories during bass training. I remember the half moon right over my head, which kept peeking out from over the clouds. And all of us were just sitting around telling jokes. I was more of a technical guy and didn't have much aptitude for comedy, so I just listened. My duty was to manage communications between my unit and all of our other guys, so that everyone knew what was going on everywhere else. I carried a box on my back, which were the size of radio devices back then, and also a ton more equipment and supplies. I was quickly assigned to a tight-knit unit who had just lost their communications operator to a landmine, and I remember the first time we made contact with the enemy. It was the loudest thing I ever heard. We were in a dense part of the jungle and couldn't see the enemy at all, but we quickly ducked as soon as they began firing at us, and we opened fire in their general direction in return. The chaos seemed to last forever, and we probably ceased fire after a couple of minutes. We advanced forward to close in on the enemy and secure the area, and it was the first time I ever saw the enemy up close. There they were, 3 dead Viet Cong soldiers laying in a pool of their own blood. I couldn't believe that I was looking at 3 human beings that were alive just moments ago, young guys who maybe had sisters or brothers and parents. They were probably just chilling around moments before we arrived, and here we are moments later looking at their motionless bodies. But I must say that I felt justified because they were the enemy and they would have been standing over our dead bodies instead. A few days later we got assigned to a different location which saw heavier casualties and needed more support. I grew accustomed to the violence and saw many of our young men die. Painfully, one day I was told by my NCO that someone wanted to speak with me. I was greeted by an older man in his late 50s who looked totally out of place. His demeanor was calculated and predictive, and even my commanding officer seemed to have turned into a yes man in front of him. He introduced himself as Rick Douglas, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and that I was going to be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders and I had no choice, so I got on the Huey and went with him. We landed in a heavily wooded area next to a few Viet Cong huts. It was heavily built up by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place here. There were some guys who had gas masks on and others standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was a very strange atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. These guys didn't act like normal soldiers, and definitely didn't have the look of fear in their eyes as most of us did. I even tried to talk with some of them, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare, like they were infected with something. Whatever it was, they all had it, and it made me feel very uneasy. Officer Douglas and I entered one of the smaller huts, and I was told to stay put until someone would come and get me. I should have just stayed there and waited, but I was too curious and apprehensive to relax. So, I just made my way out towards the main tent and took a peek inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it never had before. On a makeshift table lay 6 murky containers. Each one of them had a severed head of a guerrilla fighter inside, with several tubes and wires protruding from them. A green liquid seemed to be reacting with the heads as their mouths and eyes were quivering like they were half alive. I suddenly felt a hand grab onto my shoulder. It was Intelligence Officer Douglas, and he looked very upset. I meekly asked what they were doing inside there, but he angrily said that I should not have gone in there and sent me back to my hut. We must have been attacked or something, because I woke up a day later in triage with several broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, with no memory of anything that happened right after that. I never saw Officer Rick Douglas or those soldiers ever again during my time, if that was even his real name, and I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something. Either way, it was a strange experience that I'll never forget.
My basic training for the Air Force was at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. After that, I was sent to Shepherd Air Force Base for technical school. And after my graduation, I received orders to McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. There, my job was aerospace mechanic at first. I started on the night duty, unfortunately, so my sleep schedule was basically non-existent. My duties basically were lugging plane parts like anti-ice valves, igniters, ignition exciters, sensors, and more from the warehouse to the flight line. It was, for the most part, boring, repetitive work, especially at night. A lot of sitting around and playing games on my phone, but nobody heard that from me. It had to be like 4 a.m. at this point. I was waiting for the other guy to come drop off some parts to the flight line. He'll be referred to as Mark for the purpose of this story. I was waiting by the back cargo area of the plane we were working on at the time, sitting on a box, scrolling through my phone. Mark was taking an incredibly long time with his delivery, so I shot him a few texts. When they went unresponded to, I tried calling him a few times. The calls rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. I figured he was either screening his calls, lost his phone, or was just very busy at the moment. I waited, and he never showed up. Eventually, I got a call from Mark's number, so I picked up, but it wasn't Mark's voice on the other end. It was some random guy. He sounded like a grown man in his 40s. He said he saw I tried calling a few times and said he found this phone on the ground outside of the base. I described what Mark looked like and asked him if he had seen anyone who may have resembled him. He said he had not. It's not like he would have been allowed on the base. So my only option was to drive out there and meet him. I asked him where he was, and he gave me the name of a nearby joint where I agreed to meet him. I walked to my car, which was parked in the closest parking lot, and I drove off the base towards the place he told me to meet him. While I was mid-drive, I remembered Mark was sharing his location with me. Long story, but we basically met these 2 girls this one night while off base, who we separated from each other with. We, as a joke, started sharing our locations with each other in case we got murdered, as we kept joking. We joked about it mainly because we met them at a sketchy dive bar, but I'm not about to get into that. The place the man on the phone told me to meet him was called Tara's Tavern in Cookstown, the closest town to the base. I pulled up the location of Mark's phone, and it checked out. It showed Mark's phone location right next to Tara's Tavern. This begged the question, what was that man doing there this late? At this hour, the place wasn't open, and there were 0 cars on the road. I pulled into the little parking lot and parked. I stepped out and called Mark's phone again. The guy picked up, and he spoke in a noticeably lower voice now. I told him I was in the parking lot of the pub, and he said he was as well. He said in almost a whisper, "I'll be right over," and he hung up. It was weirder in the moment than it sounds explaining it. I looked at the location on my phone to see if it was updating, but it seemed the location of Mark's phone was in the small patch of woods about 200 feet long and 200 feet wide. I tried calling again, and it went straight to voicemail. I looked around the whole parking lot but didn't see anyone. I was all alone, not even an occasional passing car. I looked to the woods when I heard something over the sound of the crickets, like someone's footsteps. And then I saw a man. It was him. He was standing just behind the tree line between the woods and the parking lot. He called to me, "Are you alone?" And the sight of him, only his upper body visible, it was freaky as hell. I called back, "No, why?" As I inched my way closer to my car, this was one giant red flag. He called back, "Who are you with?" I didn't answer that. I got in my car and drove back to base. I called my supervisor and told him Mark was missing and someone was hiding in a patch of woods with his phone. My supervisor told me he was with Mark at that moment. He told me to meet them at the small building by the flight line. I met with the 2 and told them once again what I witnessed when tracking his phone. Mark told me what happened while off the base. He was approached by somebody outside of a 24/7 convenience store asking for a ride back to the base. Mark believed that he was actually in the Air Force at first and let him in the car. But as they were driving, the man asked Mark to pull over by the woods so he could pee real quick. Mark obliged for some reason. As Mark was pulled to the side of the road by the same small patch of woods by Tara's Tavern, he wasn't paying attention for a minute, and his door was opened by the man. Without a second to even react, the man was grabbing Mark's arms and squeezing them as he tried to pull him out of the car. Mark said he kicked at the man's groin area until he let go. He dropped his phone, and it fell out of the car during the struggle. But as he was free, he drove the car away with the door still open at first. And the next thing that happened was he went back to the base to talk with our supervisor. We, of course, called the police and all went to Tara's Tavern to check if the man was still there. The location of Mark's phone was no longer popping up on the map. It's possible the man destroyed the phone. All we did was file a police report. Some people out there are actually crazy and dangerous. Who knows what he would have done to either of us if he had gotten us in the end?